Hello, everyone. I am Ami Eden, the CEO of 70 Faces Media. We are the largest and most diverse Jewish media company in North America. Among our publications is the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, My Jewish Learning, the Nasher Feller, Hey Alma, and the New York Jewish Week. Today, we're here for a really special reason. It's the third annual Nate Geller Memorial Lecture. I'm going to say just a couple words about Nate and then turn it over to our panelists. So Nate was a beloved colleague for all of us at 70 Faces Media. And what really stood out about Nate was his quiet, steady. He wasn't afraid to speak. He spoke up, but I mean, he had a serious approach to his work, very focused and devoted to 70 Faces Media, to his family, the Jewish community, to Israel. So upon his passing, we established this lecture as really an attempt each year to explore some of the issues that were most dear to him, and to really remember Nate and how dear he was to all of us. I want to welcome Nate's wife Lynn and the rest of the family who's here, and friends as well, and encourage those of you who knew Nate to share any thoughts in the chat. We miss him and admire him, and I'm really excited about this year's lecture. I think he would be so excited at our guest Lee Yaron, who's just the kind of voice he would have been so excited not only to have linked to his name, but to have with 70 Faces Media a relatively new voice, really setting an exciting future for people who want to read about Israel and the Jewish people and the real human stories beneath it. Her book, which we'll be talking about, really is about life, not tragedy, that offers something really crucial, an intimate, ground level understanding of October 7th and its aftermath through the hearts and homes of its people. This book weaves together rich human stories of a people filled with hope and resilience and their love for their homeland, and a love that Nate deeply shared. With that, I want to hand it over to our moderator, Philissa Cramer, the editor-in-chief of JTA.
Thank you so much, Ami. And just to reiterate, to second everything that you said, it's such an honor to be here today in conversation with Lee Yaron, and in honor of Nate Geller. For anyone who has been at the previous Nate Geller conversations or lectures, this year's a little bit different. We've the last two folks we've spoken to were men who had moved from the United States to Israel and could offer a perspective rooted in that experience. Today, we're going to hear from Lee, who is living in the United States, but born and raised in Israel, where she has a career that really defies math, honestly, because she's been an investigative reporter at Haaretz for more years than seems possible. We're going to root our conversation in her book, 10/7, 100 Human Stories. Someone is going to drop a link during this conversation, maybe a few times. If you haven't gotten it yet, we're making a discount available in case you want to buy it during this conversation, probably after as well. And I'll just say, I can say a little bit more about Lee, but I'll also say about the book. It's remarkable, it really is. As someone whose job is to consume, has been to consume stories about October 7th, I really kind of dragged my feet a little bit on reading it, feeling like I knew the stories, I knew what happened. How much more did it make sense how much more time did it make sense to spend reading these individual stories? And I think Lee's book, which I'll invite you in a second, Lee, to share more about, really surprised me. Stories that I thought I knew, I learned something different. And then there were stories I'd never heard before about people whose lives were reshaped in dramatic ways on this terrible day. But not only about that, but about their lives before stretching back, their family stories and how they came to be in the Gaza envelope on that day. And a little bit about lives after. We'll talk about that. But I think, Lee, your perspective will enable us to have a conversation that stretches well beyond October 7th itself. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for supporting JTA. The chat is open for questions. We'll monitor that, and we can kind of jump in. So Lee, I mentioned you're a reporter for Haaretz. You've covered corruption, environmental issues, and I do want to stop and mention actually that of all things to talk about today, I mean, Israel is suffering a major fire that's shaping up to possibly be one of the maybe the largest fire in its history. There's just a new kind of shock each day, and I'm sure you have perspective to offer there. You covered the environment, you've covered social issues. Tell us a little bit about kind of how your career prepared you for this reporting, and then how you came to write this book. Like, where were you on October 7th, and how did the project come to be? I'll turn things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philissa. And I want to thank Tia and Ami and all of you for being here today with us. It's a very difficult day for Israelis. It's Yom Haatzmaut. I know it's a difficult day for all of you guys and everyone who love Nate. And I'm happy to at least be with this community and speak about the things we care about so deeply. I started writing this book 2 weeks after the massacre. And in a time when I felt just overwhelmed with grief and with anger and with the feeling that I need to do something for these victims. And the only thing I felt like I could do was to write about them. And that's what I've always did. I've been a journalist with Haaretz for nearly a decade. And I was always focused on human stories and stories of people on the margins of the Israeli society. If it's the elderly, Holocaust survivors, people living in poverty, people with disabilities. And covering these stories, time and again, I've seen how people in power were not just shaping the policies that affected these people's lives, they were also retelling and mistelling their stories. And if you think about what happened since October 8th, it's been the same. We've been flooded with all of this information and misinformation and disinformation about Israel and about this war. But most of this information came to us again from the top down. It came from the people in power. And we just didn't hear enough from these everyday people who lived and died on the Gaza border. So what I try to do with this book is really to reclaim the story of 10/7, to take it from the people in power and bring it back to the everyday people. Understanding the real story always lies with the real people, not with the politicians, not with the generals. And for months and months, I sat with these bereaved families and with friends and first responders. And I asked them about the life of their loved ones. I didn't want it to be a book only about death. We don't want to remember these people only as victims of Hamas, but we want to remember them for who they were, for what they believed in, for their communities and their families' histories. And what you'll find in the book that so many chapters are starting in the 40s or the 50s or the 80s, because these families have been through and lost so much even before 10/7. So the personal stories are woven together with the larger political and historical picture. And I hope they will be like windows for you to allow a better understanding of Israel in general.
Philissa, you're muted.
Oops. Thank you. We had talked about would we ask you to read, and we decided no. But I would love for you to share maybe a snapshot of a couple of stories that really have stuck with you, maybe ones where you realized in hearing them, wow, I'm hearing something and going to be able to tell a story that otherwise would go untold or unrecognized. Can you share a couple examples?
It's always hard to choose just one or two examples, primarily because the book is all about the diversity in the Israeli society. And so many people forget about it. They think about Israelis as this one voice, one thing, but the victims of 10/7 were as diverse as the Israeli society. There is, for example, the story of the Ukrainian refugees in Israel. I don't know if any of you ever heard about them, but it's a community of 50,000 people who fled Ukraine after February of 2022, coming to Israel with this hope to find a safe refuge for Jews, only to find themselves fleeing again 1 year later, this time from the Hamas rockets. Other stories are of the Bedouin community and the Israeli Palestinian or Arab Israeli minority. People forget that 22% of Israel are Palestinian Israelis, and they too fell victim to Hamas atrocities. We need to speak about them and their pain as well. And maybe, one story that is overlooked and I want to share is the story of a little girl named Tamar, 9 years old, living in a city named Ashkelon, which is the city that suffered the largest amounts of rockets from Gaza for over 20 years. Tamar was born in the last war with Gaza, the Tzuk Eitan war. So she was very used to these rocket alarms. When she hears them, she and her family need to run to the shelter in their home. And in cities like Ashkelon, they have only about 15 seconds to run before a rocket hit. And in the morning of 10/7, Tamar ran with her family to the shelter over 17 times. Every day after 10/7, they needed to run again and again. And she was so afraid that her mother found her one day stealing knives from the kitchen and hiding them under her pillow. When she asked her, Tamar, what are you doing? Tamar said, well, if a terrorist will come and dad is not in the house and is working, I want to defend you guys and I want to fight. Again, she's 9 years old. And after 2 weeks like that of running again and again to the shelter, Tamar had a heart attack in the age of 9. And she died. And Israel recognized her as a victim of terror. It's obviously an unusual case because not every 9-year-old will have a heart attack from living in this constant fear. But I think her story shows something larger about so many other Israelis who are living in this constant fear and weren't victims of 10/7, but are still suffering very horribly.
I want to stay there for a second because you're extending the trauma of October 7th to now, and I think obviously the situation has morphed several times, and the tensions or the stresses are both the same and also different now. One of the things we've tried to report about using one of our reporters in Israel is about the efforts to support the mental health needs of people who experienced the attack or even 1 or 2 clicks removed from direct experience, but still like Tamar experiencing the effect of this trauma. And it feels like there's a real just competing narratives. We hear from people, for example, who are at Nova, that the only help they're getting is help they're creating themselves. And then the Israeli government is saying, no, we've done this, this, and this, and that's as much as any government could ever be expected to do. Like, we fulfilled all of our obligations, and there have been fights in Knesset about whether enough is being done. There's been a dispute about tallying the suicides that have that are associated with trauma from October 7th. What's your take? Like, what's the true story of the effects that are extending to this day, in terms of mental health, or I guess even physical health, like Tamar's?
I mean, we see it in the numbers that Israelis in large are experiencing depression like never before. I mean, if before 10/7 it was one in 7 Israelis who was using addictive prescription medication or alcohol or drugs. The last survey by the health department show it's 1 in 4 Israeli adults now. The use of antidepressant and anti-anxiety medication has risen in 20% just in 1 year. The medications people take to sleep. We see even smoking rates. Israel is a country of smokers, but even the smoking rates have increased to 21% of Israeli adults. Weight gain, especially in the South, all of these things that show us that people are dealing with so much pain. And also, one of the most troubling data I've seen is the number of people calling to the emergency hotline seeking for help. We saw more than 300,000 Israelis who called in the last year, and 60,000 of them were children who felt like they had no adults who can hear them and support them, and just called an anonymous hotline and say, hey, we feel so much grief and fear, and we don't know who to reach out. These numbers are very real, and unfortunately, the Israeli government is not doing what they should in this subject and many others, but in this subject as well, to support Israelis.
Are you still talking to the subjects of your book? Are you like following them to now? And do you have a sense of their ability to access support or restitution or whatever their needs may be? Like, are they getting them met?
I'm in touch with many of them, very brave families who were ready and agreed to open up and share their stories. A lot of them feel like the Israeli government is not seeing their pain. Many of them have still never received even a call from a government official saying, they share their grief. Some of them are from other countries, and they said they got, a call from the Prime Minister of France or even from Joe Biden before anyone from the Israeli government spoke with them. Some of them, especially from the Bedouin community that I wrote about, spoke with me a few months ago that they still don't have shelters near their homes. They live in areas that are not protected by the Iron Dome, and they're afraid that more people from their families will be hurt by missiles that were fired until recently, but they can't get the government to even bring shelters to their areas. So many problems.
We have a question from a reader about whether any of the stories in the book are through the eyes of, or I guess about the perspective of soldiers. Are they included in your storytelling?
Some, mostly the book is about civilians who were murdered on 10/7 or survived. But there are some stories of soldiers. One of them is of Sagi Golan, who was about to marry Omer Ohana, his boyfriend for many years, a week After 10/7, he was a high-tech employee from Herzliya, but also a reserve soldier. And when he saw what happened on the morning of 10/7, he didn't even got a call from his commander yet, but he immediately just wore his uniform and drove down to the south from his home in Herzliya, going to his unit and volunteering. And he was among the people who were rescuing the families hiding in Kibbutz Be'eri when he was unfortunately killed by a Hamas terrorist. And after he died, his partner Omer fought to pass a law in the Israeli Knesset that the benefits and the recognition to LGBTQ soldiers' partners will be the same as for a husband and wife. And he was able to change the law for the first time.
And I'm reminded that there's another soldier story that you mentioned who's a friend of yours, and I wanted to invite you if you wanted to speak a little bit about him as well.
The book is dedicated to Gal Eisenot. Gal was a close friend of mine. We grew up together in Herzliya. He was the most loving and wonderful friend I ever had. He was 25 years old, and he was a student studying to be a doctor. You might heard his name because his father, Gadi Eisenot, was the chief of the IDF and a minister. But Gal never chose a military path for himself. He was more about curing and helping. But still, when he was called up to a reserve service, like so many other young Israeli men and women, he volunteered. And the most important thing for Gal was to bring back hostages. So he was risking his life, and still he said he would do anything to bring hostages back. And Gal died on December 7th, 2 months after the massacre, in a mission trying to bring back bodies of hostages to Israel. I was completely broken by his death. All of his friends and everyone who loved him were, and he died while I was writing the book. And it really taught me a lot, finding myself in this other side of grief, in a way, among these families I was documenting. And it was pretty amazing when some of these families that I was interviewing read what I wrote about Gal for the Israeli paper. They were among the first to call me and say, hey, we know you lost someone you loved. Can we be there for you? Can we support you? So the book was very, very personal in this way.
Thank you. And I think it really does come through in the book, and the way you tell stories, that you're seeing things from different sides, different angles, at all times, or really pushing yourself to do that. And that strikes me, I think, because now, a year and a half into the war, where we have a very different kind of a increasingly calcified kind of political discourse around it. So much of the stories that could be told feel like they get flattened in so many of the ways that they're consumed. Your stories you tell don't really lend themselves to getting shared on social media. And I don't think you have like a, reels where whatever, social posts about them or anything. I don't think that would work because they're so textured. And at the same time, that's not, we see people consuming and repeating and amplifying and distorting stories about what happened on October 7th and afterwards, in a way that's I find it's interesting, and it teaches us something about our discourse, but it's also not the same stories. They're different stories. And I'm curious for your reaction to that, and for you to kind of reflect on the way the communal storytelling about that day and its aftermath has developed.
Was one of the first thing I understood after losing Gal, when I was reading Israeli newspapers reporting about his death. It was so painful because I couldn't recognize my friend in the coverage about his death. It was so politicized, and he was described as this hero and a fighter and a soldier. And of course, he was that as well. But I wanted people to know something about him, about his personality, about his individuality, and the things he believed in and cared about, and his family, his history, like to understand something deeper from his story. And I just couldn't. And my goal with this book, in many ways, was to give these families what we didn't have for Gal, to have these people remembered as human beings, not as political figures. And they are very different from each other. For example, so many of the stories in this book and so many of the victims of 10/7 were from the peace community, the kibbutznikim, the people who chose to live near the border with Gaza because they believed in coexistence. I checked their voting rate. 94% of them voted for left-wing and central parties who supported a two-state solution. So many of them gave donations to families in Gaza every month for over 20 years. Some of them were volunteering with Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank, taking them to Israeli hospitals to give them better health care. Some of them did it 2 days before they were murdered by Hamas. We forget that, and a lot of these families are saying, and they feel very betrayed by global media and the whole discussion about 10/7 not recognizing who they were and what they believed in, and how so many Israelis actually want and worked for peace and for a solution for their Palestinian neighbors and friends.
So I want to stick with that for a second, because before the fires broke out in central Israel today, the biggest news that we were paying attention to was an attack by right-wing activists on a Reform synagogue in Ra'anana, where there was a screening of a peace-oriented Memorial Day ceremony. The attitudes that the people that you're writing about devoted themselves so much to advancing do not feel like they're the prevailing. They didn't feel before 10/7, and they certainly don't feel now like they're the prevailing attitudes in the country. Can you just tell us a little bit about the status of the peace community and what future you see for that conversation?
In so many ways, it's still difficult to speak about the future in Israel when, people are still mourning or still waiting for the hostages to return. It still feels 1.5 years later like we're reliving this day of 10/7 over and over again, like time is frozen in a way. But we definitely see a change when we're looking at the numbers. If a decade ago, about 60% of Israelis said in surveys that they still believe in peace and in a two-state solution, a month before the massacre, it was about 50% of the Israelis. And when we're checking the numbers now, it's about 25 to 30% who say they still believe in peace and that we should have a two-state solution. So that's a big change, and we see the same numbers in the Palestinian society. About 12 years ago, 58% of the Palestinians said they still believe in peace. And a few days before the massacre, there was a survey that spoke about 28% of Palestinians. So, and I'm speaking, with so many of these people from the peace community, and they're saying, in many ways, we feel like fools. We lost our communities, we lost our family members, we lost our friends, we lost our homes, and we lost everything we believed in. You hear that a lot. There are a lot of meetings now of these people from the kibbutzim with settlers, with people from the Israelis who live in the West Bank, saying we were always against you. And now we think maybe you're right. We're seeing a lot of that. We also see some families who have deepened their commitment for peace. Bereaved families, like the families who conducted the ceremony you just described, a shared ceremony of Israeli and Palestinian families who over 20 years are conducting this ceremony every year together and are saying we are sharing the same pain and the same grief. And we don't want revenge. We want to move forward. And the only way for us to heal is to work for peace. And we're seeing many families who are doing talks together around the world and fighting for peace more than ever. And I think, it will depend a lot in the younger generation of Israelis. And a lot of people forget it, but 50% of the Israelis, and I'm part of this generation, are 30 years old or younger. And this number, 30, means that we were born with or after the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. And in so many ways, in the end of the era of the hope for peace. I never lived in a time when I felt hopeful that this conflict will end. And in all of the years of the Netanyahu era, Netanyahu is the prime minister for 18 years now, not in a row, but in total, we were told that this conflict will never be solved. It will just be managed. And that with technology and the Iron Dome and our strong IDF, Israelis will have a good enough life to live with this conflict. And we kind of try to forget about it and live our own lives. This conception has definitely, was broken on October 7th. And though the young generation of Israelis is turning right to the right wing, I am hopeful, and I have to believe that in a few years, in a decade from now, our generation will be the one to complete what was suddenly ended before we were born, to complete the task of Rabin. When Rabin came and signed the Oslo agreements, he said, I'm speaking with you as a soldier. I'm speaking as a representative of the country where parents bury their children. And as a soldier, I'm saying, enough with the blood, enough with the tears. And it will be up to our generation who fought this war in Gaza and lost so many people to say enough.
You just said, it's your hope that in a few years that's going to happen, that there's going to be a change. What would you point to as reasons for having that hope, for having an expectation of change? Are there signs of that, or what are some of the other possible ways that I guess your generation or the younger generation may take this question forward?
Look, there are 10/7 was the first Shabbat in 39 weeks where Israelis weren't protesting. For 39 weeks before and for so many weeks now after, Israelis are in the streets fighting then against the judicial overhaul or reform or however you want to call it, and now against this government and for democracy and to bring the hostages back. These are hundreds of thousands of people who are fighting in the streets. And they make me very hopeful, and I don't think we should ignore them. Of course, this government of the extreme right wing is making me very concerned about our democracy and our future. And like so many other Israelis, I am deeply, deeply concerned. But I believe that hope is an action. And, if all of my generation will give up and leave Israel, we will certainly will not have a better future. And unfortunately, we're seeing this trend as well. Just in 2024, 80,000 young Israelis left the country, more than ever before in 1 year, joining 50,000 people who left in 2023. And these are the doctors and artists and writers and mostly liberal people from Central Israel who are concerned about our future, and for now prefer not to live in Israel. So there are many, many good reasons to be afraid and not hopeful. But I think it's up to us to act and fight for the Israel we believe in.
So you're among that group, physically at least, not currently living in Israel, though I think you're dividing your time. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of your experience of being here through all of this, and also maybe what you've learned from encountering American Jews, both by living here and by promoting your book here? What have you learned about us that you didn't know and that gives you a different way of understanding your own home?
I'm splitting my time between the US and Israel now. I've been here since the book came out in the US this October, and also a lot of time in Europe because the book came out in 7 countries. So I'm just heading to Germany next week to speak with Jewish communities and general public over there. Look, I've learned a lot about American Jews. First, that they don't speak Hebrew. I've learned that you guys are so suspicious of each other, and that the inner fights between these local JCCs and local federations and reform and conservative are really, made me feel at home. I also learned that Americans deeply, deeply care about Israel, and the connection between our two people is stronger now than ever. What our government is doing is affecting you guys every day, and the other way around. And I understood that a better future for Israelis will depend on American Jews as well, and I think vice versa. And I think we should work together a lot more. One of the things that I've just been so disappointed from being in the US is this unofficial boycott against Israeli and Zionist writers and artists. I am feeling it every day. I guess you all heard about these letters calling to boycott all Israeli art institutes and cultural institutes, these blacklists of Zionist writers sent to publishers with names of people who even showed empathy to the victims of 10/7, calling not to publish them anymore. I think it's very concerning, and there's like these two kinds of unofficial boycotts happening in the US now. When I call them, I think about them as the megaphone and the whisper. When the megaphone is like this, all of these public declarations that we just spoke about that are truly led by ideology. But then underneath it, there is this whisper boycott by these managers of book festivals and editors and people working in film and TV who used to work with Israelis for many, many years before 10/7 and under closed doors are telling me and are telling so many of my colleagues that they don't have a problem working with us and bringing voices from two sides of the conflict, but that they are just, it's too dangerous for them to do it right now, that they are afraid of a protest against them, that they are afraid to be canceled, a boycott that is led by social and economic fear and not ideology. And it's unfortunately very, very effective. I'm afraid that Hebrew culture and literature will disappear from global stage in a few years from now if nothing will change. I'm speaking, colleagues from Israeli publishing houses are saying that they're getting calls every day from international authors asking not to have their books translated to Hebrew anymore. I'm hearing from these people that they don't fly so much anymore to the book fairs because it's so hard to even sell literature by Israelis in this time. And, my book was, I believe, only published in so many languages because I was very fast. I started writing it just after 10/7 and sold it in November of 2023. But a lot of things that were supposed to happen after were canceled because people were afraid. And I think it's, if these people are thinking that by boycotting all Israeli artists and authors, they're helping to create a Palestinian statehood, I think they're wrong. I think they're achieving the opposite goal because they're silencing the liberals and the people who try to work with Palestinians, and they're only strengthening the most extreme voices in the Israeli society who always said, everybody hate us, we have no allies, and there is nothing to do but to defend ourselves with weapons. I think they're achieving the opposite goal, and it's very dangerous.
It's very interesting to hear you say all of this because I think, obviously we've been reporting about questions around a boycott, an unofficial boycott, for a long time. And it's a lot easier to see an official boycott show up in sales numbers or numbers of deals. And when it's the kind of effect that you're describing, more of a apologetic, look, I just can't do this right now. It's not you, it's me kind of thing. Like, it's harder to see as journalists. And so hearing your perspective is really illuminating. And I hope that over time, we'll be able to see it more clearly. I'm curious, like you mentioned you're going to Germany, so I'm curious for you to share a little bit about the places where you have found reception beyond the Jewish community, and then also, in this alternate universe where Americans who haven't previously thought that much about Israel, but are are interested in this kind of storytelling, what if you could get their ear, like what would you tell them that's different from what you're telling us, a group of readers of Jewish journalism?
I think the key is creating empathy and dialogue. And I believe literature is the best form to create empathy. If we want to move forward and if we want a better future for Israelis and Palestinians, we have to speak with one another. Boycotting is not helpful to any of us. And when I was in Europe, I found people who were much more open for a conversation. And I was surprised that it was so much more difficult in the US. When I was doing my events in France, for example, the book was a bestseller the first week. And I had Muslims and Christians and people from all over coming to the talks, and people and the people who were interviewing me weren't just Jews, they were just journalists, and they weren't afraid for their careers to speak with an Israeli. And some of them asked me difficult questions. Some of them asked me, well, why did you write a book about Israelis and there are so many Palestinian victims? And I answered and I said, I'm an Israeli and I'm writing about the pain of my people. I'm not writing about our pain to erase the pain of Palestinians or to forget about the Palestinian victims. I share their grief, and I'm looking forward to read the books by Palestinian authors about what they're going through. Palestinians don't want me to write their books now. And we could have a dialogue. And unfortunately, in the US, it seems to be like a Jewish book or an Israeli book that people who are outside of our community are afraid to even speak about it. They're afraid of being canceled. So the thing that every time I have a chance to speak outside of the Jewish community, I'm speaking about the fact that justice is always a compromise, and about remembering it's people and people. I think too many people see Israelis now for their government policies. They see all of us as Netanyahu, all of us as Itamar Ben-Gvir, but it's completely false. And Israel is like all other people, has every right to have their own country and have every right to dream about a better future and work for it. And
it does feel like in a polarized moment or a hyper polarized moment, we keep saying it's more polarized than it's ever been, and then it gets more polarized, that empathy is like almost feels like a liability in the public square and not a muscle that's valued or developed or rewarded. And I'm curious kind of what advice you would give, I guess, to American Jews, to Israelis, like how can we bring empathy into our public discourse? What would be your advice?
I always start with an individual story and then bridge from there, speaking about the larger historical and political context. I feel that facts alone or knowing history alone, explaining our pain and trauma and multi-generational pain is not helpful without sharing real stories of people. And I do find, especially when I share these stories that are less known, like the stories of the Ukrainian Israelis or the stories of the Palestinian Israelis and the peace community. A lot of time when I'm sharing these stories, people are so surprised. They don't really know Israel and they don't know these different communities. A lot of time people think that all Israelis are white people. If you've been in Israel or Israelis, it's ridiculous. So many of us came from fled Arab countries. 1 million Jews fled Arab countries when Israel was founded and had to come to Israel. So a lot of times when we're sharing even one story, we can open it to a larger discussion and start this dialogue.
I have a couple more questions. I want to do a time check for anyone who has questions to please share them in the chat. We have 10 or so more minutes. And I want to actually I'm going to extrapolate a question from a longer comment here, which I think is interesting. The commenter is identifying a divide or potential divide between on the ground soldiers and reservists who are maybe having a different experience of the war at this point, and really pointing to a class divide within the army. And I'm interested to know kind of both, do you see a class divide as being a driving force in Israel's internal tensions right now? And what divides, I guess, are you paying most attention to as you think about a future where some of those might get reconciled?
I wouldn't say it's a class divide. And you know, the Ashkenazi Mizrahi divide that we spoke about in Israel for many years is, I just saw a survey that only 12% of Israelis said it's the most crucial issue today. I think that the divide is between the Israeli center and left and the Israeli right wing, or even between the supporters of Netanyahu and the people who think Netanyahu is destroying the country. The fear of many Israelis for the future of our democracy and of the steps that already happened is real. And I think, you know, that's the big thing that we need to overcome. That's the thing that every Israeli is thinking about every morning and every evening, and brought us almost to the verge of a civil war between us before 10/7. And we're unfortunately again in this point, even in this, you know, day like today, like Yom HaZikaron, it's a day that usually unites all Israelis. And, you know, even today when ministers went to speak at the official commemorations, so many families and audiences were screaming at these ministers, "Go away. You're responsible for the death of our loved ones. You're responsible for destroying our country. We don't want you here. Go away." We've never seen this anger in the streets like we see it now, even in this day that was supposed to be a day of unity.
So what gives you hope? I mean, one of the things we talked about before was, well, I'll let you answer the question, and then before I lead you into it, what gives you hope for a new direction in the future, or for Jews in Israel and abroad to develop the muscle of empathy that you say is so essential? Like, where do you find hope right now?
One of the most overlooked aspects of this war is the gender aspect. And I want to take a moment to think about that and to think about our future. I don't know how many of you know, how many women do we have in the Israeli Cabinet of War? Anyone here knows? Right, none. How many women do we have in the teams negotiating about the hostages, to bring back the hostages? Right, none. How many women are there in the Hamas leadership? Right, that's a joke. But the point is that in both sides of this conflict, there are just no women in decision-making processes. Then I'm thinking about who were the only people, almost the only people who warned us that this war was coming. It was young female soldiers, 18, 19, 20 years old, who were doing this thankless job at the role of spotters, or tatzpitaniyot in Hebrew, where they needed to sit and stare at the border for hours and hours every day. They weren't allowed to move their eyes, and that's why it was a role that was given only to female soldiers. And their role was to report to their commanders if they see any suspicious activity of Hamas. And these young soldiers saw that something was wrong. And they saw it months and weeks before the attack. And they reported again and again. And you know what they were told? They were told, girls, you're not the brain, you're just the eyes. And their reports were ignored. Then I'm thinking about the peace movement. And I'm thinking about who led the peace movement. And I'm thinking about what happened on October 4th. There was this huge peace march of Palestinian and Israeli women walking together between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. They signed what they called the Mother's Call, and they said, as mothers, we have more that unites us than separates us. And we have one ask from our leaders, to go back to the negotiation table and speak with each other. Because all of us, we want our kids to be alive and we want to prevent the next war. And they gave these beautiful speeches about peace. And 3 days later, on October 7th, the co-founder of the Israeli Peace Organization, this amazing, amazing woman named Vivian Silver, was murdered in her home in Kibbutz Be'eri alongside 3 other members of the Israeli peace movement. So I'm thinking about what would be different if we have listened to the Tatzpitaniot, the spotters, when they warned us. And what would be different if we tried and listened to these mothers and try to speak again. And I think that a next step that we can all agree about, doesn't matter what we think, if we're left or right, and what we think about the future, one step we can agree on is to have women in decision-making processes in both sides of this conflict. I'm sure that will bring us to a better future, or at least will be a first step towards a better one.
There's an election next year in Israel. Do you have any prognostication about women getting involved or there? Or do you think we'll see a change in the gender dynamics in the election process?
Unfortunately, now we have a government with the lowest amount of women we've ever seen. There are some talks behind the scenes about a new party of hostages and bereaved families that we might see for the next election. And I really hope that we'll see some of the amazing, amazing mothers and sisters and former soldiers who we see now in the streets also going to politics and helping us to create a better Israel.
So I think we've reached the end of our hour, but I thank you for it's can sometimes feel difficult to find that spot of hope, and I think you're leaving us with that and with a kind of ellipsis that maybe there'll be a second set of stories that will have a different feeling and point in a new direction in Israel's near future. I want to remind everyone that you have a discount code to buy Lee's book, and really you'll see everything in there that the strength of Israel and the challenge of Israel and the problems facing Israel and the hope that people have despite everything. And I think I just want to thank you, Lee, for being here, and thank all of you for being here, and say once more that it's really an honor to have this conversation in Nate's memory, and talk about all of the things that he cared so much about. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be with you today.